Last night it showed a river. This morning, blood. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Your messages always brighten this dark journey. It was in the early spring of 1892 that I, Dr. John Watson, found myself once more at Baker Street, seated opposite my friend and erstwhile companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The soot-streaked windows allowed only a reluctant light to filter into, the room illuminating the familiar disarray. Chemical apparatus abandoned mid-experiment, Turkish slippers stuffed with correspondence, and the morning's Times folded open to the art column, an unusual choice for Holmes, who typically held paintings in no higher esteem than he did superstition. I had barely settled into the armchair with a cup of Holmes's potent coffee when a knock sounded at the door. Before Mrs. Hudson could arrive, Holmes had already risen. "That will be our visitor, Watson," he said, "a collector by trade, and judging by the ink smudge on the knuckle of the right hand, one who has been writing in some distress. Your correspondence? I take it? No, merely the brushstrokes of fate. Come in." The door opened to admit a tall, thin man of perhaps 50, immaculately dressed in a tailored frock coat, his hair slicked back and his moustache trembling as though from nerves or suppressed indignation. He carried a flat leather portfolio under one arm, which he clutched as if it was some fragile and priceless relic. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. "I am. And this is my friend and associate, Dr. Watson. Please, sit. I believe you have come regarding a painting." The man blinked. "Yes, indeed, sir, though how you knew—" "Your sleeve bears the faint ochre mark typical of old linseed-based varnish. Your boots carry dust from Piccadilly, not far from the Melis and Thorn Gallery. A recent visit, I presume." The man seemed to gather himself. "My name is Horace Dunwood. I am the executor of the late Sir Felix Delamere's estate and, more pertinently, the curator of his private collection. As you rightly noted, I was at Melis and Thorn just this morning, on business concerning one of Sir Felix's most beloved works, and it is that painting which brings me here." He laid the portfolio across his lap and looked gravely at us both. "You may have heard of The Lady in Mauve by the Austrian master Karl Hoffmann." "Of course," said Holmes without hesitation. "Painted in 1871. A masterclass in chiaroscuro and romantic melancholy. It has not been publicly displayed for nearly 3 decades. Precisely. It remained in Sir Felix's study for all that time, untouched. But 3 days ago, something occurred that I can scarcely believe. The painting changed." I raised my eyebrows. "Changed, Mr. Dunwood? In what sense?" Dunwood unfastened the leather case and withdrew a glossy black-and-white photograph. "This image was taken a week ago. Note the subject's posture, the way she turns slightly away from the viewer, her hand on the velvet armrest. Now this morning I returned to the house to supervise packing for the estate sale. The room was sealed untouched, yet when I looked again at the painting, her hand was no longer upon the armrest. It is in her lap." Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes took the photograph and examined it for several long seconds. Then, in a rare motion, he stood crossed to the fireplace and stared into the empty grate, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I do not believe in hauntings, Mr. Dunwood," he said at last, "but I do believe in human interference. What you describe is a deliberate act, executed with precision and cunning. This is no accident of varnish or decay." "That is precisely why I've come to you," Dunwood said fervently. "The Delamere house is locked. The servants are dismissed. And I alone have the key. No one could have entered." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then someone must have never left." "Sir?" Dunwood asked, startled. "Tell me, was the house ever broken into? Has anything else changed? Objects moved? Books disturbed? Perhaps something added that should not be there?" "No, at least nothing I could detect." Holmes paced once, twice, and then fixed his gaze on the curator. "You say the painting is to be sold?" "In a week's time. Then I suggest we pay a visit to Sir Felix Delamere's study without delay." He turned to me. "Pack your revolver, Watson. A painting that alters itself is not nearly so curious as the hand that alters it unnoticed." I nodded. It was, as always, the spark of mystery in Holmes's eye that stirred in me both the thrill of the chase and the dread of what might lie ahead. The game once more was afoot. By 11:30 that same morning, Holmes and I were seated in a hansom cab, rolling steadily through the stately lanes of Kensington. Mr. Dunwood sat opposite, his gloved fingers still clasped tightly around the leather case that had housed the photograph. Though he had said little since our departure from Baker Street, the rigid lines of his posture betrayed an unease that Holmes, for once, did not immediately comment upon. "I presume," Holmes said, suddenly breaking the silence, "that no alterations or restorations have been attempted on the lady in mauve in recent years?" "None," replied Dunwood with conviction. Sir Felix was adamant that the painting remain untouched. He prized authenticity above all else. I recall his exact words: "Let the brushstrokes of the master endure, unspoiled by the clumsy meddling of time or man." "A noble sentiment, if a romantic one," Holmes murmured. "And the room where the painting hangs, it has remained, sealed since his death." "Indeed. Sir Felix passed 6 months ago, and the study was locked shortly thereafter. I've held the only key. The servants, those that remained for the winding down of the estate, were never permitted inside. The Delamere solicitor insisted upon the strictest preservation." "Excellent," Holmes said softly, then turned his gaze to the passing streets, lost in thought. The Delamere residence stood on a quiet crescent behind iron gates, its Gothic stone facade streaked by decades of London rain and shaded by thick yews. As we approached the entrance, Holmes's eyes roved over the windows, the roofline, the eaves and drainpipes. "No signs of forced entry," he murmured. "No damage to the guttering, no disturbed foliage below the sills. Either our culprit is an artist with a skeleton key, or this is a matter more curious than we have allowed for." Inside, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The air was musty with old leather and age-polished wood, and a thin film of dust lay undisturbed upon the marble-tiled floor. Dunwood led us up a wide staircase to the second level and along a corridor lined with empty sconces and solemn ancestral portraits. At last, he halted before a heavy walnut door with an oxidized brass handle. "I unlocked it this morning," he said, turning the handle with a faint squeak. "But I've touched nothing since. I felt it best to preserve the room exactly as I found it." Holmes inclined his head and stepped inside. The study was large and square, with a high-domed ceiling and a mullioned window facing the rear garden. Bookcases lined 3 of the walls, and a faded Persian rug covered most of the dark wooden floor. The desk, a monstrous claw-footed thing of oak, stood at the center like an altar, its surface untouched, but for a few crystal paperweights and a silver letter opener. And above the fireplace hung the object of our journey, the lady in mauve. Holmes approached it silently. I followed close behind and looked up at the painting. It was, even to my untrained eye, a work of rare and subtle power. The lady, pale and delicate, sat in a straight-backed chair of carved rosewood, the folds of her mauve dress cascading down her lap like moonlight across velvet. Her gaze was averted, wistful, perhaps sorrowful, and her right hand now rested loosely upon the pleats of her gown. I glanced at the photograph in my hand. There unmistakably her fingers curled around the carved edge of the chair's armrest. "It is not merely a trick of memory," I murmured. "It has changed." Holmes was standing barely a foot away from the frame, his magnifying glass held to one eye. He did not speak for several minutes, examining each quadrant of the canvas with surgical precision. At last, he stepped back and folded his arms. "The brushwork," he said, "is masterful, even in the altered hand, but not quite Hoffman's. There is a touch less restraint, a boldness in the new lines. See there, the soft fold beneath the wrist, cruder, only marginally, but enough." "You mean to say," I asked, "that someone has painted over the original?" "Not quite. Not over, Watson. Around. A new layer, yes, but exceedingly thin, so precise it mimics the original tone and texture. It would take a highly skilled hand to attempt such a forgery, and an even more cunning mind to execute it on an existing masterwork." Dunwood looked pale. "But why? Why alter the hand? What significance can it possibly hold?" "That," said Holmes, "is what we must ascertain. Let us suppose the change is symbolic. What does the shift in pose imply? A retreat from the world? A relinquishing of control? The lady is no longer anchored to her environment. Her connection to the chair, her frame, if you will, is gone. She withdraws. He circled the room slowly, eyes roving over every inch. At one point he stopped, stooped, and examined the edge of the Persian rug near the hearth. Here, Watson. See the faint drag in the pile? Something heavy was moved. Recently. I crouched beside him. The rug bore a faint scuff, like a trail. Where furniture had been shifted, then replaced. The desk, I offered? Perhaps, or something smaller. That pedestal there, yes, move it. Between us we shifted the marble stand near the bookcase, revealing beneath it a small, near-invisible square of folded paper, yellowed with age. Holmes snatched it up and unfolded it carefully. The writing was in German, hastily scrawled and smudged. What does it say? I asked. Holmes squinted. Sie beobachtet immer noch. German? Yes. It translates roughly to, she is still watching. A silence fell over the room. Dunwood stared at the note. But who left it? That, Holmes said grimly, is our second question. The first is, who was meant to read it? He crossed to the desk and opened each drawer in turn, sniffing lightly at the interior of one. Turpentine, he said. A minute residue. Someone worked here, cleaned brushes perhaps, and used German phrasing. A connection to Hoffman? But Hoffman has been dead 20 years, I protested. Quite. Yet his legacy clearly lives on. And someone who knew this room well, believed they could change a fragment of art and not be noticed. Holmes turned sharply toward Dunwood. You say only you held the key? Yes. And no one else had access to Sir Felix's study? No one living. Holmes's brow darkened. Then we must consider the dead. I opened my mouth to question, but Holmes raised a hand. Not ghosts, Watson. Merely those whose influence lingers. We shall need to examine Sir Felix's correspondences, his financial dealings, and most urgently, his will. Dunwood nodded, visibly shaken. They're locked in the solicitor's office, but I can arrange for you to examine them. Chatter. So, and one more thing. Have any of the other paintings in the house been disturbed? Dunwood blinked. I hadn't thought to check. Do so immediately, Holmes said. This was not an isolated act. It was a message. He turned back to the lady in mauve and looked long into her painted eyes. And messages, Watson, are meant to be read. The return journey from the Delamere house was cloaked in a brooding silence. Holmes, chin tucked deep into his collar, stared absently through the window of the cab, while I busied myself reviewing the details in my mind. The altered painting, the whisper of turpentine, the scuff in the rug, and most peculiarly that cryptic German note, Sie beobachtet immer noch. She is still watching. It clung to my thoughts like a cobweb, elusive and unpleasant. As we crossed the Thames and turned toward Baker Street, Holmes finally stirred. There is an undeniable theatricality to this, Watson. Someone wants us to believe that the lady in mauve has a life beyond the frame, but it is not a ghost story, it is a performance carefully rehearsed. For whose benefit? I asked. He did not reply immediately. Perhaps for Sir Felix himself, perhaps for someone else. That remains to be seen, but I mean to find the author of this act and uncover what prompted it. No sooner had we arrived than Holmes sent off a telegram to the firm of Mellis and Thorne, requesting a list of artists affiliated with their restoration department over the last 10 years. Another was dispatched to Sir Felix Delamere's solicitor, demanding immediate access to the deceased's correspondence and will. Holmes then immersed himself in his files, rifling through a stack of clippings and catalogues until he unearthed a brittle exhibition program dated 1873. He examined the page listing Hoffman's works, making small notations in the margin, his eyes gleaming with something that resembled curiosity, crossed with suspicion. It was not until the next afternoon that we were admitted to the solicitor's office. A small and musty chamber just off Lincoln's Inn Fields, filled with stacks of ledgers and bound volumes. Mr. Kershaw, a bent, dry fellow with a pince-nez and the complexion of aged parchment, met us with initial protestations that the estate documents were not yet in order. But Holmes's sharp tone and the flash of a Scotland Yard card, borrowed from Lestrade the previous evening, swiftly loosened his reluctance. "The letters, Mr. Holmes," he said, unlocking a tall cabinet, "are in chronological bundles. You may begin with those addressed to the deceased in his final year." We spent an hour poring over the papers in silence. Most were mundane, requests for loans, invitations to clubs, inquiries regarding art purchases. But near the bottom of the stack, Holmes drew a sheet from its envelope and tapped it. "This," he said, handing it to me, "should interest you." The letter was written in a feminine hand, dated 4 months before Sir Felix's death. The stationery bore a faint lilac scent and a crest embossed with a tiny swan. "My dear Felix, you persist in silence, and yet I feel you still consider the promise we made, the pact we forged beside her, as you called her then. I fear the years have altered not the painting, but us. If you intend to break that vow, know that I shall not remain idle. You may erase her hand, but you cannot silence her presence. I am not blind to the weight of your guilt, nor the cowardice. In your retreat, do not forget she is still watching, never see. You may erase her hand," I repeated. That phrase again, the same note, but now clothed in more overt sentiment. "Indeed," said Holmes, "and we have a signature, or at least an initial. C. Could it be a family member?" Holmes shook his head. "The tone is too charged with personal betrayal. It speaks of intimacy and of some shared history involving the painting. The promise we made, that is key. Watson, you will recall that Sir Felix was known to have had no children and never married. But there were murmurs years ago of a liaison with a Viennese soprano, one Clara Weiss. She disappeared from the public eye quite suddenly. And you think Clara Weiss might be our C? It is a working theory, but one with plausible weight. Her association with the Austrian circles would explain the note's German phrasing. And if she was indeed the model, or at least the inspiration for the lady in mauve, it would render her possessive attitude more understandable. But why wait all these years to strike? Revenge, Holmes said simply. Or perhaps closure. Emotional debts age poorly, Watson. And Clara Weiss, if it is she, may have believed that by altering the painting she was correcting a lie. We continued reviewing the papers, but found no further mention of the mysterious Clara. Holmes requested copies of all letters bearing foreign stamps or written in German, and Mr. Kershaw promised to have them delivered by morning. As we left the office, Holmes paused on the threshold. "One final question, Mr. Kershaw. Do you know who first discovered Sir Felix's body?" The solicitor adjusted his pince-nez. "A maid, I believe, hired to clean the lower floor. She found him slumped in his chair in that very study. No signs of violence, I presume?" "None. He was declared to have suffered a seizure." Holmes nodded. "Yet he died in the same room as the painting. I begin to wonder whether his heart truly gave out, or whether it was broken." That evening Holmes returned to his violin, drawing long, melancholy strains from the instrument as I attempted to pen a few notes from the day's discoveries. He paused only to remark, "We must find Clara Weiss, and I suspect she does not wish to be found. But there is one place where secrets find little refuge. He tapped his bow gently against the side of the instrument. "The Royal Academy's archive. If Hoffmann ever exhibited her likeness, even in another form, there may be sketches, studio notes, perhaps even a patron's diary. If she was the lady in mauve, then someone else must have known." As dawn broke, a wire arrived from Mellis and Thorne. A single restorer had been employed in recent months for private consultations, an Austrian émigré named Lucas Heim, formerly a student at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Holmes smiled grimly. "We have Clara, and now we have her painter." By midday we stood before the modest facade of number 14 Farringdon Row, a narrow townhouse with ivy curling up the wrought iron railings, and a faded brass plaque beside the door that read, "L. Heim, Fine Restoration and Portraiture." Holmes had insisted we make no prior appointment. He preferred, as he often did, the advantage of catching his subject unguarded, lest a lie have time to don its costume. The maid who answered our knock admitted us with a hesitant glance toward the tall figure of Holmes, who entered with the decisive air of one who had already deduced the floor plan of the house. The studio was situated on the upper level, more attic than salon, its large skylight casting cold white light across the wooden floor and the scattered canvases propped along the walls. Paints, rags, varnish bottles, and stretched linen formed a cluttered perimeter. At the far end stood a man before a large canvas, brush suspended mid-stroke. He turned slowly, revealing a pale, narrow face framed by dark, curling hair. He could not have been more than 35, though the lines between his brows suggested a temperament of nervous intensity. He wore a painter's smock, streaked with ochre and viridian, and his eyes, keen and faintly evasive, darted between Holmes and myself. "Mr. Lucas Heim?" Holmes said evenly. "Yes," the man replied, setting the brush aside with deliberate calm. "You are Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We've come regarding your recent private work, specifically for the late Sir Felix Delamere." Heim's mouth twitched barely. "I was told the collection was not yet open to the public." "It is not," Holmes said smoothly, "but art, like truth, often demands an audience before its creator is ready." Heim stepped away from his easel. "I do not know what you mean. Come now, Mr. Heim, you were hired to inspect or restore a painting in the Delamere house. The Lady in Mauve, a notable piece, you surely remember it." A flicker of emotion crossed Heim's face. Indignation, perhaps, or defensiveness. "I was asked to examine several works, that one among them. I was not told to alter anything." Holmes moved closer. "Yet it was altered, and only someone with your training and discretion could have done so without detection. A subtle redirection of a hand, a repositioning of gesture, a very deliberate change." Heim's silence was more eloquent than denial. He glanced toward the window, then said stiffly, "I did what I was instructed to do." "By whom?" "Was paid through an intermediary. A woman, she called herself Miss Weiss." There was no shock in Holmes's eyes, only a glint of satisfaction. "Describe her." Heim hesitated. "Late 50s, perhaps. Foreign, German, or Austrian. Elegant. A manner of someone used to being obeyed. She said the painting was hers. That Sir Felix had wronged her. In what way, she did not say. Only that she had waited long enough, that he had made her a promise in that room and then betrayed it. She brought a sketch, showed me how the hand should appear, paid me well, asked that it be done overnight while the house was empty. She claimed to have a key. And you asked no further questions?" "I am a restorer," Heim said defensively, "not a detective. If a client requests a private commission and pays accordingly, even when the work is criminal," I said, stepping forward. Holmes raised a hand. "Mr. Heim, we are not the police yet. But you are implicated. It would be better if you cooperated." Heim's expression faltered. "I never thought it would matter. Sir Felix was dead. What harm could it do?" She seemed desperate, as though she had waited years to reclaim something that had been taken from her. Holmes considered him for a long moment. "Was she present while you worked?" "Yes. She watched me the whole time. Sat in the very chair beneath the portrait." "Ah," Holmes said softly. "She wanted to see it happen, to undo what had once been done, and when it was finished, she left without a word, but she placed a folded note beneath the pedestal, said it was part of the message." Holmes turned on his heel. "We're done here for now. You will not leave London, Mr. Heim. Should you do so, I will see to it that your passport and every gallery wall you hope to hang a painting on is closed to you permanently." Heim did not protest, merely nodded, defeated. Back on the street, Holmes walked briskly, his coat flaring behind him like a banner of war. "We are close now, Watson, very close." Clara Weiss was not content with vengeance. She wanted recognition. She wanted her presence reasserted. "You believe she altered the painting not as punishment, but as reclamation?" "Exactly. She sees herself in the Lady in Mauve. Perhaps she is the lady, but here is the deeper wound. Sir Felix erased something of her, something sacred to her memory. The hand, the connection, and she has restored it defiantly, as if to say, 'I was there, you cannot paint me out.' I was silent a moment. But why the secrecy? Why hire Heim? Why not come forward?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Because the painting isn't all she's restoring. There is more behind this. A second act, something left unfinished, and I suspect Sir Felix's death was not so simple as we have been told. You believe she killed him. I believe she may have caused his death, and perhaps, Watson, just perhaps, Not with poison or knife, but with something far more dreadful. What could that be? Confrontation, Holmes said grimly. After decades of silence, she reappeared, demanded he acknowledge what he had buried, a guilt so profound it froze his blood, a secret so terrible that it unstrung his very heart. We had barely returned to Baker Street when Mrs. Hudson appeared, eyes wide. "Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes. Urgent, from Scotland Yard." Holmes tore it open and read aloud. Body found. Female, mid-50s, identified as C. Weiss. Room at Brighton Seaside Inn. Death unnatural. Notes and sketches left behind. Request immediate consultation. Holmes stared at the paper, then folded it neatly and tucked it into his pocket. "She made her final brushstroke, Watson. Now we shall see the full canvas." We departed at once for Brighton. The train to Brighton rattled through the late afternoon mist as Holmes sat motionless in the compartment, fingertips pressed together, and eyes unfocused, as though they saw far beyond the raindrop-streaked window. I had learned not to interrupt him during such silences. He was working, just not in any way a layman would recognize. His mind was arranging pieces, turning facts, over like chessmen, finding the unseen thread that connected them. When at last he stirred, it was to speak with quiet gravity. "The death of Clara Weiss, if indeed she has died, may bring with it the final key. Her involvement with the painting was no mere sentimental errand. She was trying to communicate something more." "A message to whom?" I asked. "The world." "Two. One man in particular, Sir Felix. But she was not content merely to have him acknowledge her presence. She wanted the truth revealed. I believe the alterations to the lady in mauve were merely the opening lines of her confession." As we stepped off the train into the cool sea air of Brighton, we were met by Inspector Bainbridge, a sturdy, sharp-featured man with the clipped speech of someone who disliked wasting words. He led us at once to the seaside inn where the body had been discovered. "She checked in 3 nights ago under the name Miss Clara Vogt," Bainbridge explained as we crossed the lobby. "But the identification in her handbag matches a passport, issued to Clara Weiss, Austrian national, no signs of forced entry. Chambermaid found her in the chair by the window, dead before breakfast." "Breakfast? Cause?" Holmes asked as we climbed the narrow staircase. "Coroner suspects poisoning. No glass by the bedside, but a vial in her handbag, empty, unlabeled. We've sent it to be analyzed. There was no suicide note, but, well, you'll see." The room was small and simply furnished. A window looked out onto the grey sea. Clara sat as if asleep, her body still upright, her head tilted to the side, one hand resting in her lap, the other hanging limply over the armrest. Her features, though drawn in death, still held the contours of a woman once accustomed to admiration. On the writing desk beside her was a folder of aged papers, a thick envelope, and a torn corner of canvas bearing a partial oil sketch, the unmistakable sweep of mauve silk and a woman's wrist, mid-gesture. Holmes stepped past Bainbridge and moved toward the desk. "Do not touch her," he said softly to the constable standing watch. "Everything in this room speaks. Let us not mute it by clumsy hands." He opened the folder. Inside were several letters, old and creased. I leaned in beside him and began to read. "To whomsoever finds these pages, know that what was altered in the painting was not simply a hand, but a truth buried in guilt." He made me promise silence, and I kept it for too many years. But he betrayed the canvas as he betrayed me. I was not merely the model for the lady in mauve. I was her subject in every sense. He swore the painting would hang in his home forever, unchanged, an eternal acknowledgement of what we shared. But then he married another, quietly, a woman of wealth, for appearance only. He hid me away, and when the scandal neared, when our daughter was born, he had the hand painted out. That hand was mine, resting upon the carved arm of the chair he gave me, the one piece I took with me when he forced us apart. He said it had to be done, for reputation, for politics. He removed me from the painting, and in so doing from history. But she, our child, grew, and she bore the shame he refused to claim. She died in obscurity, and I withered alongside her, forgotten. Let this be his epitaph, not the honors of a gentleman, but the cowardice of a man who feared the brush more than the blade. I have no other justice but this." Holmes said nothing. He lifted the torn canvas scrap with gloved hands, studying the quick brushwork. "Her own hand," he murmured. "This is not Hoffman. This is her tribute to herself, her mark, her presence, her resistance." "Good Lord," I whispered. "The woman in the painting, she wasn't just a muse, she was the scandal he buried." "And the mother of his child," Holmes added. "It was not mere vanity, nor even revenge. It was reclamation. The reassertion of truth." Inspector Bainbridge cleared his throat. "This was also in the envelope," he said, holding out a faded photograph. It showed Clara in her youth, seated in the very chair from the painting, the carved rosewood back unmistakable, her hand resting on the armrest exactly as depicted in the original image. Holmes took the photograph, compared it with the canvas, scrap, and nodded once. "She recreated the pose decades later to show it had never changed, that she had never changed, not in her own eyes." I stood by the window and looked out at the waves. "She wanted Sir Felix to see it before he died." "She did more than want it," Holmes said. "She made certain of it. She returned to the house under cover of darkness, through channels unknown, with a key likely stolen or duplicated long ago. She directed Heim to repaint the hand. And then she confronted Felix. That confrontation may not have ended with poison or knife, but it was a death all the same. Guilt took him, Watson. A man cannot edit the past without cost." Holmes turned to Bainbridge. "Seal the room. Keep her undisturbed until the coroner finishes, then send all the contents, papers, photograph and canvas fragment, to Scotland. Guard with my name affixed. As for Heim, do not arrest him, not yet. He is an instrument, not the hand." Back on the train, Holmes was pensive. As the dusk deepened and lamps lit up across the countryside, I ventured to speak. "Do you believe she intended to die, Holmes?" He looked at me gravely. "Yes, she had nothing left but memory, and she had given that memory form, restored. Yet once she had spoken, there was no longer a need for breath. And yet," I said quietly, "the painting remains." Holmes nodded. "The lady in mauve is no longer just a mystery on canvas. She is testimony, a confession, a history denied and reclaimed, and that is why it had to change, so that those who look at it now will see not just artistry, but truth." He leaned back, closed his eyes and murmured, "Justice is not always swift, Watson, but sometimes it comes in the most unexpected hues." It was the morning after our return from Brighton that Holmes's mood turned sharply. The usual languor of his post-case repose, his tendency to smoke contemplatively by the fire or fiddle with the violin, was absent. Instead, he was awake before sunrise, pacing the length of the sitting room with hands clasped behind his back, and that singular glint of dissatisfaction narrowing his eyes. I had seen it before, most notably in cases where the apparent conclusion felt a shade too clean for his taste. "I do not like the shape of it, Watson," he said without preamble. "Clara Weiss is dead. Her confession has been found. The altered painting explains her motive, but it is too tidy. Neat endings are for novels, not for real life." "You suspect someone else was involved?" Holmes halted mid-stride and turned sharply. "I suspect we have not yet uncovered the true heart of the matter. Clara's actions were personal, intimate, deliberate, yes, but she was also a woman acting with restraint. She left a message, not a trail of bodies. Yet her daughter, whom she references so mournfully, died in obscurity. How? When? And why? Did she die without record? There's a hollow in the story, Watson, and I mean to fill it. I opened the morning edition of the Times, which lay folded on the table. As if summoned by our conversation, an article in the lower corner bore the headline, "Obituary Correction, Sir Felix Delamere." In light of recent inquiries, a legal addendum to the estate of the late Sir Felix Delamere has been submitted by Messrs. Kershaw and Reed, naming an unacknowledged heir, one Miss Violet Morland, who predeceased Sir Felix by 6 years. Details remain private pending formal review. I passed the paper to Holmes without a word. He read it once, quickly, then again more slowly. "There she is," he murmured. "Violet Morland, Clara's daughter, Felix's daughter, but predeceased him by 6 years? That puts her death around 1886, and yet I recall no mention of a Violet Morland in any register of society or scandal. She was buried in silence, Watson, as her mother lived. She would have been a young woman," I said, scanning my notes. 20, perhaps? Likely so. The peak of life. And she died unnoticed. That, Watson, is where the true crime lies. Not the alteration of a painting, but the erasure of a person. I will not allow it to remain buried. Holmes dispatched 2 telegrams within minutes, one to the registrar's office at Chelsea, requesting any and all death records pertaining to a Miss Violet Morland between 1884 and 1887, the other to Inspector Bainbridge, inquiring whether Clara Weiss had any effects on her person, hinting at family ties or addresses, specifically anything bearing the name Violet. By early afternoon, a reply came from Bainbridge. Among the items found in Clara's handbag was a pressed violet, dry and crumbling, preserved in a small notebook. Between the pages was an address, 22 Renwick Street, Lambeth. It was a modest part of the city, largely working class, known more for its laundresses than its legacies. Holmes did not hesitate. "Coat and boots, Watson. We're going to Lambeth." The house at 22 Renwick Street was a narrow, grey-bricked building in a row of near-identical dwellings, each with soot-darkened windows and a lingering smell of coal smoke. An elderly woman answered our knock, peering at us with suspicion from behind a cracked doorframe. "Miss Violet Morland?" Holmes inquired. The woman sniffed. "No one of that name lives here." "Lived," Holmes said gently. "Some years." "Hago, we are not with the police. We seek only information." The old woman considered, then opened the door wider. Violet was here, rented the upper room, quiet thing, died in 86. Fever, they said, though she looked more heartbroken than ill. Did she have visitors? "One regular," the woman said, leading us up a narrow staircase. "A man, older, well-dressed, came in the evenings, always left late and kept his face down, paid her bills in coin, never name, but I recognized him once, saw him in the paper. Sir something, him with the collection." "Sir Felix Delamere," Holmes said softly. The landlady nodded. "That's him." We entered the room at the top of the stairs. It was long since cleared, now used for storage, but the marks of past occupancy lingered. A faded square on the wall where a picture had once hung, the faint outline of a rug in the dust. Holmes moved slowly through the space, his gaze sharp and unblinking. "She lived here," he said, half to himself. "She loved and was cast aside. And when she died unacknowledged. But Felix kept paying for the silence." We learned from the landlady that Violet had no funeral. Her body was taken by the parish and interred in a common plot at Kensal Green, with no headstone. "I remember," the woman said. "Her mother came once, just once, after she passed, sat here for hours and didn't say a word, left a flower behind." "A violet," I said quietly. Holmes knelt beside the hearth. There, half obscured in the dust and shadows, was a small charred stub, too uniform for coal. He picked it up and turned it over. "A painted matchstick," he said. "Studio kind. Used to light turpentine-soaked cloths. She must have painted here. Back in Baker Street, Holmes stood by the window as twilight settled over London. He seemed subdued, reflective. The canvas of the mystery, once centered on a changed hand in a portrait, had expanded to something far more human. A life lost, a truth erased, and a final act of reclamation by a mother who had loved too fiercely to let the world forget. "The painting now bears more than artistic value," he said at last. "It is, in its current form, the only surviving testimony to Violet Morland's existence. Sir Felix tried to preserve his reputation. Clara preserved her daughter's memory. And in doing so," I said, "revealed what he tried so hard to bury." Holmes nodded slowly. "Justice is rarely a hammer, Watson. Sometimes it is a brushstroke." There was a quiet knock at the door. A boy with a telegram stood there, hat in hand. Holmes took it, opened it swiftly, and read aloud. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "Stop. Death of Sir Felix to be reconsidered. Stop. Autopsy reveals traces of digitalis. Stop. Foul play now suspected. Stop. Scotland Yard requests your assistance. Stop. Holmes looked up, eyes cold and clear. It seems Clara Weiss's confrontation may have been more final than we imagined. He turned from the window, and I knew from the set of his jaw that the game was no longer merely afoot. It was sprinting toward its end. That evening, the wind moaned down Baker Street like a voice from the grave. Holmes stood at the hearth, unmoving, the flicker of firelight dancing along his sharp features. I sat nearby, telegram still in hand, rereading the words that had changed the complexion of our investigation in a single line. Traces of digitalis, foul play now suspected. For several long minutes, Holmes said nothing. Then he turned, his voice clipped and low. Sir Felix was murdered, Watson. Digitalis is no subtle killer. In large quantities it ravages the heart, and yet it mimics most cunningly the very thing it destroys. It could not have been Clara, I said quietly. The timing doesn't permit it. She must have left the house days, perhaps weeks before he died. Holmes nodded. Correct. Bainbridge confirmed in his earlier report that Sir Felix's body was discovered 6 days after his last known visitor. The coroner's initial assumption was a natural death. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. But the presence of digitalis changes everything. We must now ask, who stood to benefit from Felix's death and who possessed the means to deliver such a poison? The heir, I offered, but he had none. No family save the child he disowned. Holmes gave a thin smile. That is what we were led to believe, but the amended obituary suggests otherwise. Recall the language legal addendum, naming an unacknowledged heir. That phrase is no accident. Kershaw, the solicitor, must have received new documentation after Felix's death, naming Violet Morland as the legitimate heir. Clara must have submitted it, but Violet was already gone, which complicates matters. She left no offspring, no spouse. That we know of, Holmes said. But if someone, anyone, stood to inherit through Violet, then Felix's sudden demise becomes altogether more convenient. A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a parcel wrapped in heavy brown paper. From Scotland Yard, sir. Marked urgent. Holmes thanked her and sliced it open with his penknife. Inside was a stack of documents, a copy of Felix's autopsy, the estate's updated will, Clara's personal effects catalogued by the Yard, and, most curiously, a letter sealed in crimson wax. Holmes broke the seal and unfolded the sheet. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a firm, practiced script. To the executor of the Delamere estate, I write to inform you of my claim on the estate of Sir Felix Delamere as a direct descendant of Violet Morland, deceased. My mother's rights having been denied her, I now submit full documentation of lineage and request the transfer of all entitlements in accordance with English law. Signed, Anna Weiss. Holmes stared at the signature for a long moment. Anna Weiss, he murmured. Daughter of Violet, granddaughter of Clara, she exists. But why did Clara never mention her, I asked. Why speak of Violet's death and not her child's survival? That, Watson, Holmes said gravely, may prove to be the final twist in this tale. If Anna exists and has submitted documentation posthumously on Violet's behalf, it means she has spent years waiting. And she has emerged now, just after Felix's death. I must know when that letter was posted and from where. He rose, seized his coat, and was halfway out the door before I could finish pulling on my boots. We arrived at Kershaw and Reed just after noon the following day. Mr. Kershaw received us with his usual rigidity, but even his paper-dry demeanour could not conceal the discomfort that Holmes's questions induced. Yes, Kershaw admitted at last, removing his pince-nez and rubbing the bridge of his nose. Miss Anna Weiss's claim arrived 4 days after Sir Felix's death. The letter was posted from a lodging house in Clerkenwell. She provided birth records, a private midwife's sworn statement, and a locket containing portraits of Violet, and a child. Her child. Why was the matter not made public? Holmes asked. We were in the process of verifying the claim. It was delicate. The estate, as you can imagine, is considerable, and the will Sir Felix left made no mention of Violet or any heir. But should Anna's documentation hold, it supersedes the original by law. And did you meet her? Kershaw paused. No, she corresponded only by post. Holmes's mouth drew into a tight line. Then she is a shadow, one who appeared at the very moment Felix died. Curious timing. Back on the street, Holmes was already steps ahead, murmuring to himself as we walked. Digitalis is difficult to detect when delivered in increments. Cumulative, delayed, that is its strength. If Anna visited Felix under another name, perhaps even posed as a nurse or estate agent, she could have administered the poison gradually, yes, and never drawn suspicion, especially if she gained entry under pretense of estate business. A grieving heir or a patient avenger? We made our way to the address in Clerkenwell from which the letter had been posted. It was a humble lodging house above a grocer's. The landlady, a stout woman with iron spectacles and flour-dusted sleeves, confirmed that a young woman had stayed there for 2 nights, paying in cash. Called herself Miss Arkwright, she said. Dark hair, sharp eyes, kept to herself. But I remember her sketching, always had a pad in her hand, drew faces from memory. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Did she leave anything behind? The woman shook her head. Only a charcoal stub and some crumbs, far as I know. Holmes left his card and requested immediate notice should the woman return. That night, Holmes stood for hours in silence at the window, watching the gaslight flicker in the mist below. I saw in his face the certainty that we were close, tantalizingly close to the architect of the entire affair. Clara's tragedy, Violet's erasure, Felix's guilt, all seemed to converge upon this final figure. Anna Weiss, the hidden heir. She has outplayed us thus far, he said at last, but she made one mistake. I looked up. What mistake? She altered a painting to reclaim a story, but in doing so she stepped from the shadows and into the record. Her name, now, exists on paper. That is enough. He turned, eyes alight with renewed purpose. Tomorrow, Watson, we will find her, and we shall learn whether her cause is one of justice or one of calculated revenge. The following morning brought with it a heavy, slate-colored sky that threatened rain, but held its burden just long enough to lend an oppressive weight to the air. Holmes was up before sunrise, having slept little, if at all. He pored over street maps and parish registries with surgical intensity, while I prepared a pot of strong tea. The faint scratch of his pencil on paper was the only sound in the room as I watched him from the armchair. She'll not remain still, he said suddenly, without looking up. Anna Weiss has revealed just enough of herself to claim a fortune, and yet taken great pains to avoid exposure. Her decision to post the letter from Clerkenwell was strategic, populated, transitory, and anonymous. But the choice of lodgings and the description of her sketching habits betray a mind both artistic and restless. That, Watson, is the thread we will follow. He stood, gathering his coat. Bring your revolver, not because I expect violence, but because people pushed into corners sometimes bite. Our first stop was the Royal Academy. Holmes's connections. They ran deep, and we were swiftly admitted to the archives. He requested access to recent admissions records, specifically any related to portfolio reviews or anonymous submissions bearing the Weiss name or initials. After nearly an hour, the archivist returned with a small folder and a puzzled expression. Only one relevant item, Mr. Holmes. A portfolio submitted under the pseudonym A.W. last spring. No formal name was given, but the application was accompanied by sketches matching the Hoffman style rather uncannily. Holmes opened the folder and examined the samples. His lips pressed into a thin line. This is no amateur's hand, Watson. Look here, the brush technique, the muted palette. This artist is more than capable of modifying an original without detection. The same hand that guided Heim, I dare say, could also paint what Heim only executed. The final page of the portfolio included a faint imprint of a return address, partially erased but still legible. Studio 3C, the Ashford Buildings, Whitechapel Road. Holmes's face lit with the peculiar energy he displayed only when he sensed the quarry nearing. We have her, Watson. The Ashford Buildings proved to be a ramshackle warren of converted warehouses, now rented as cheap artist studios. the scent of turpentine and coal smoke thick in the corridors. Studio 3C was on the third floor, its door unpainted, a single, brass numeral hanging askew. Holmes knocked once, sharply. There was no answer. He gestured silently, and I tried the handle. It gave way. Inside, the room was sparse but orderly. A small cot, a crate of books, and along the far wall, a workbench scattered with brushes and pigments. The easel at the center of the room held a half-finished portrait of Clara. Not Clara. As she was in death, but younger, luminous, her eyes lifted in quiet defiance. It was unmistakably the same face from the lady in mauve, yet here imbued with life, as if defying the passage of time. Holmes moved swiftly but carefully, opening drawers and scanning the edges of the floorboards. In a locked tin beneath the cot, he discovered a ledger and a small velvet pouch. The ledger, when opened, revealed a precise log of dates, names, and payments. Some entries referred to art commissions, but several pages were devoted to the Delamere estate. One entry, dated a fortnight before Felix's death, simply read, "Final dose prepared. Strength adjusted. He will not see the week's end." I exhaled slowly. That confirms it. Holmes examined the velvet pouch. Inside were 2 glass ampoules, one full, one empty, and a fine silver spoon with traces of a yellowish powder. She used digitalis, Holmes said matter-of-factly, and knew precisely how to dose it. A soft sound stopped us both, a click from the door behind. We turned. A woman stood in the threshold. She was young, perhaps no older than 25. Her features a mirror of Clara's, high cheekbones, dark eyes, and a composure that was all the more striking for its stillness. She held no weapon, made no move to flee. Instead, she stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind her. "You found it then," she said. "I was wondering how long it would take." Holmes regarded her for a moment. "Anna Weiss." She nodded. "Though I've used other names, I expect you've gathered most of the story by now." "We have," Holmes said evenly, "but there are gaps, and your presence here offers the chance to fill them before the authorities arrive." Her expression did not change. "Then you'd better ask quickly. Did you kill Sir Felix?" Anna stepped toward the workbench, placing her gloved hands upon it. "Yes, though not in the way you think. I didn't smother him or slip poison into his brandy. I simply let the past speak. A little powder in his morning tea. Each day, a little more. But the real poison was memory. My mother wrote to him once. I watched her fold the letter, watched her wait for a reply that never came. When she died, I promised I would finish what she started. Your mother," I said carefully, "was Violet Morland." "She was never Violet Morland," Anna replied bitterly. "That name was given to erase her. My grandmother called her Isolde. It was the name Felix had asked for once, when they thought they would live openly. But fear turned him into a liar, and a liar needs the truth to vanish." Holmes's voice was gentler than I expected. "You altered the painting, didn't you? Not Heim." She looked up at that. "Heim was my hands, but not my eye." I sketched what needed to be restored and guided his every motion. He had the brush, I had the memory. I made sure she was seen again. "You could have claimed the estate lawfully," Holmes said. "Why kill?" Anna shook her head. "Because the law serves the living, not the forgotten. Clara died with nothing, my mother with less. I didn't want the money. I wanted truth and justice, not in courtrooms, but on canvas, in silence, where he couldn't hide behind titles and respectability." There was a pause. Holmes stepped toward her, his tone now firm. "You will need to answer to the law nonetheless. There is no truth without consequence." "I'm not afraid," she said simply. "I've already signed my name to it. Let the world know who we were. That's all I ever wanted." Outside, footsteps echoed on the stair. Bainbridge, arriving as Holmes had no doubt arranged. Anna Weiss stood composed and still as the door opened once more. Holmes did not look at her as they led her away. Instead, he turned back to the unfinished portrait and stared long at the face of Clara Weiss, reborn in pigment. She did not kill Friedtau. "Gain," he said quietly. She killed to unbury the past, and in doing so she painted herself into history. He closed the ledger, tucked it beneath his arm, and walked out into the grey London evening without another word. Rain had begun to fall in a slow, persistent drizzle by the time we returned to Baker Street. Holmes was quiet during the journey, his face unreadable, eyes half-lidded beneath the brim of his hat as we rattled through the greying streets of the city. I knew better than to speak. There were moments when the weight of a case lingered on him like smoke. This was one of them. Once home, he shed his coat and sat by the fire, his fingers steepled before him, and for a time the only sound was the steady hiss of raindrops against the windows. The clock on the mantel chimed 4. I lit a lamp. "At last," he said, not lifting his eyes. "We have the full composition." I stirred in my chair. "You believe there is nothing left hidden?" "No. Mystery endures forever, Watson. Not even those built upon shame and silence. But this one, it was layered like varnish. Clara's sorrow, Violet's exile, Anna's vengeance, each acted out of love, and each was condemned for it in her own way." He rose and went to the desk where the ledger, retrieved from Anna's studio, lay beside the folded sketch of the lady in mauve, her final iteration. He opened the ledger to the last page, where Anna had written a line that had not caught my attention earlier. "What cannot be spoken must be painted." Holmes read it aloud, then shut the book softly. "There is a certain cruelty to art," he murmured. "It immortalizes, yes, but it also imprisons. Clara believed that by restoring the hand, her hand, she could free herself from erasure. But Anna, poor girl, saw the painting not as freedom, but as judgment. The same canvas that preserved her grandmother's likeness reminded her daily of what had been stolen from her family. And so she took it upon herself to finish the composition, to fill in what history had left blank." I hesitated, then said, "You pitied her." Holmes turned toward me with a weary smile. "Pity is not the word, Watson. I understood her. That is far more dangerous." He poured himself a measure of brandy, sipped once, and returned to the hearth. "Inspector Bainbridge will see her charged, of course," I said. "But do you expect a conviction? Do you expect a conviction?" Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "That depends. If the case is judged purely on evidence, the matter is simple. Premeditated murder, use of poison, false identity. But if it is judged as a story, as a tragedy, then perhaps the jury will see what I saw, a girl trying not to kill a man but to give voice to two women the world chose to forget." "And what of Heim?" I asked. "Does he stand accused?" "He will be questioned," Holmes said. "But Anna used him as an instrument. He did not know her plan. And as for Kershaw, the solicitor, he was merely a gatekeeper, not an accomplice." I drew my chair nearer to the fire. The weight of the case sat heavy on my shoulders too. It had begun with a changed hand in a painting, and had unraveled into a tale that felt more like Greek tragedy than London crime. After a time, Holmes spoke again. "There's a final matter to attend to. The painting itself." I looked up. "What of it?" "It remains at the Delamere estate, locked in the study. The estate is now tied in probate, awaiting resolution of Anna's claim. Until that time it will be sealed, but surely it will be moved, preserved elsewhere." He gave a faint nod. "Eventually. But I have made a recommendation to Bainbridge that the painting remain in situ, unaltered. Let it hang where it always did, the lady with her hand restored. A monument not only to artistry but to memory." A knock at the door drew us from our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes accepted it and opened it swiftly. His eyes flicked over the page, then he passed it to me. "From Inspector Bainbridge, Scotland Yard to Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street. I. Weiss investigation. Anna Weiss formally charged. No defense entered yet. Expresses no remorse. Requests. One final visit from you before proceedings begin. Please advise." I glanced at Holmes. "Will you go?" He was already reaching for his coat. We arrived at Newgate just before dusk. The prison clerk led us through the stone corridors with the heavy clank of keys and a muttered warning that the girl had hardly spoken since her arrest. As the door creaked open, we found her seated at a plain wooden table, still dressed in her charcoal grey coat, the collar turned up as though to guard her from more than the cold. She looked up as Holmes entered, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "You came." "I always do," he replied. "I won't deny it," she said before he could speak. "I know they think I'm mad, but I am not. I knew what I was doing." "Then tell me why," Holmes said. "Not what you told the Yard. Tell me the truth." She leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because he could have done the right thing. He had every chance. He could have named my mother. Could have claimed me. But instead he paid to keep us invisible. When my grandmother died, I opened the old letters. I saw what he had taken, and I thought, if he will not carry the burden, I will." Holmes was silent a moment. Then, "You could have had your claim recognized, legally, respectably." "I didn't want respectability," she said with sudden vehemence. "I wanted to undo the lie, and for that, he had to die." She drew a deep breath. "He never once acknowledged me, not even at the end. I waited outside the house for 3 nights before I knew he was truly gone. And only then did I send the letter to the solicitor. Only then did I sign my name." Holmes gave her a long, searching look. "Do you regret it?" She hesitated. "Not yet." Then, more softly, "Maybe later." He nodded. "That is the most honest answer anyone has given me in this affair." When we returned to Baker Street, night had fully fallen. Holmes sat at the window for a long time, watching the gas lamps flicker through the mist. I left him alone with his thoughts, but just before midnight I heard him speak, his voice low and distant. "Justice is not always the same as the law, Watson, and sometimes the hand that reaches from a painting tells us what the tongue dares." "Not." I said nothing. There was nothing more to say. The next day dawned colorless and wet, as if the sky itself had dimmed in mourning for the story that had unfolded across the last week. I rose early, compelled by a restless unease, and found Holmes already at the breakfast table, though the untouched toast and coffee suggested he was feeding thought, not hunger. He had a newspaper folded beside him and was reading an envelope, addressed in an unfamiliar hand. When he noticed me, he slid the letter across the table without a word. I unfolded it carefully. "Mr. Holmes, you asked me last night if I regret it. I told you, not yet. That remains true. But I have begun to wonder whether it matters how I am remembered. If nothing else, you will understand this. I never wanted to become a ghost. I only wanted my family's story to be seen. I've enclosed a key. The painting, the one I never finished, is in Studio 3C, behind the canvas of my grandmother. You may do with it as you like. A.W." The key was small, brass, wrapped in a square of blotting paper. I looked up to find Holmes already watching me. "We're going back," he said simply. "There's something she didn't want the rest of the world to see." An hour later, we arrived once more at the Ashford Buildings. The corridors were quiet in the Sunday hush, the smell of oil and turpentine lingering as if the air itself remembered the strokes of its residents. Holmes moved without hesitation through Studio 3C, crossing to the canvas of Clara Weiss that still stood upon its easel, a haunting image in shades of lavender and iron grey. Behind it was a secondary canvas, propped against the back wall, draped in a muslin cloth. Holmes pulled the cover away with a single motion. I took a step forward and felt the air thicken. It was a family portrait. Not formal, not posed, but intimate, alive. Clara, older and weary but serene, was seated in the same carved chair that featured in The Lady in Mauve. Standing behind her was Violet, Isolde, with her arms resting lightly on Clara's shoulders. And at Clara's knee, gazing up at her, sat a child, a girl of perhaps 5 or 6, her dark hair curling against her cheeks, her expression bright and adoring. Anna. There was no signature, but it was unmistakably Anna's hand. The brushwork was different from her earlier sketches, more fluid, more vulnerable. There were smudges along the edges where fingers had pressed too long, perhaps in hesitation or grief. Holmes studied it without speaking for a long time. "She painted them as they were never allowed to be seen," he said finally. "A mother, a daughter, a granddaughter, a truth denied by name and status, but here given form beyond law and concealment." "She could have sold it," I murmured. displayed it, used it to prove her claim. She knew the courts would see only bloodlines and records, Holmes replied, not brushes and faces. This was not for the courts. This was for us, for whoever might care to see what had been hidden. He stepped back and lowered the muslin cloth gently over the frame. Come, Watson, there's one more matter. Back in Baker Street, Holmes spent the afternoon writing a letter, longer than any I had seen him compose. He wrote with surprising care, pausing often, occasionally consulting Clara's letters, or glancing toward the photograph of the lady in mauve, which still lay atop his files. When he finally sealed it in a stiff envelope and addressed it to Inspector Bainbridge, he handed it to me to read before dispatch. Inside, he made his case, not for Anna's innocence, which he did not claim, but for her intent. He cited her restraint, her calculated avoidance of violence until driven by silence, and the full picture of generational erasure that had brought her to the moment of Felix Delamere's final breath. I leave it to the Crown to judge her crime, he wrote. In closing, but let them not judge it blind. I returned the letter silently. He gave me a rare look, an expression not of pride but of solemn duty fulfilled. That evening, as the fire cracked low and the fog deepened outside our window, I asked Holmes the question that had been stirring within me for days. Do you believe Anna was wrong? Holmes answered without delay. I believe justice was not served by Sir Felix in his lifetime, and when justice fails long enough, the people it forgets sometimes serve it themselves. He stood and crossed to the shelf, where a thin volume bound in faded green lay tucked between medical journals. From it he retrieved a clipping, the original exhibition notice for Hoffman's The Lady in Mauve, dated 1872. There's a small note in the margin, he said, handing it to me. Sitter unnamed at artist's request. That was how. She vanished, Watson. From the very start. Her name was taken, and with it her claim to the canvas. He placed the clipping back in the book, as if tucking the matter away at last. Some days later we received word from Bainbridge that the court had accepted Anna's plea, not of innocence, but of diminished responsibility. Her sentence would be reduced, and the matter of the estate was to be delayed pending further review of her documentation. Holmes read the telegram without expression. But I noticed that when he next picked up his violin, the melody that filled our flat was not one of cold calculation or eerie deduction. It was a lullaby, gentle, resolute. And as it faded into the hush of Baker Street, I realized the case had not merely revealed a mystery, it had restored a voice. It was nearly a month to the day since that first curious visit to Baker Street, the man with the leather portfolio and the tale of the altered painting, that Holmes and I found ourselves once more in the drawing room of the Delamere estate. The legal proceedings had been settled with remarkable speed, owing largely to the evidence Holmes had unearthed, as well as the persuasive nature of his letter to Scotland Yard. Anna Weiss, now serving a commuted sentence at Holloway under humane conditions, had elected to relinquish the estate entirely, stating in her declaration that no home built on silence should be mine to claim. Yet the painting remained. The lady in mauve had not been moved. It still hung above the hearth, framed in the late afternoon light that filtered through the tall windows. And though the room bore the chill of long disuse, there was something undeniably warm about the way the painting now looked, no longer a relic of prestige or secrecy, but a quiet testament to those who had been erased and had, in the end, restored themselves. Holmes stepped forward and studied it for the final time. There is no mystery left here, he said almost softly, only memory. I nodded, still absorbing the subtle power of the figure on canvas. The woman's hand, Clara's, rested once more upon the carved arm of the chair, just as it had all those years ago. There was no need for further investigation, no more threads to pull. The story had been told not only through Holmes's deductions, nor even through Anna's confession, but through the canvas itself, its silence louder than any court testimony. As we stepped back into the corridor, Holmes paused and turned toward me. Watson, do you know why this case unsettled me more than most? I shook my head. Because it was never about solving a puzzle, he said. It was about recognizing what had been intentionally ignored. That is a far rarer pursuit. In my line of work, we are trained to look for what is present, the footprint, the bloodstain, the motive. But this demanded we see what had been removed. He looked down the long hallway where portraits of long-dead Delameres lined the walls, and then back to the door we had just passed through. To restore what has been taken, he murmured, requires a different kind of precision. We returned to Baker Street as the sun dipped behind the chimneys, casting long shadows that stretched across the cobblestones. Mrs. Hudson brought tea, and Holmes accepted it without ceremony, settling into his chair, violin case at his feet. The flat was quiet, peaceful. I opened my notebook, unsure whether I would record the case as I had so many others. Some truths, I thought, were not meant for publication, not in full. And as I glanced across at Holmes, who now lifted his violin and began to draw a soft, haunting strain from the strings, I thought again of Anna Weiss, of Clara, of Violet, of the painting that had been changed, not merely in form but in meaning. The final note of Holmes's melody hung in the air for a moment before fading. He rested the instrument on his knee and said, almost absently, "In the end, Watson, this was not a tale of crime at all." "No?" I asked. He shook his head. "It was a tale of remembrance." And with that, the fire crackled softly between us, the shadows deepened, and the case of the painting that changed overnight was, at last, put to rest.